There's a lot of conjecture out there regarding the proximity to an airport that you can legally fly a model aircraft. Perhaps what started as a suggestion by CASA has been misinterpreted by many as an actual regulation or law. Let me start with a disclaimer. What I'm discussing is relevant for Australia based on the legislation that came into effect in 2002. New federal legislation comes into effect in September 2016 and may have an effect on this message. This message is about the hobby use of small remote-controlled planes, helicopters and multirotors, not the commercial operation of the same. I am not a lawyer and you should not consider this information legal advice. Let me start by introducing CASA, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. This is the federal government department tasked with maintaining, promoting and enhancing the safety of civil aviation in Australia. They are sort of like the police of the skies that enforce the aviation regulations. The regulations or laws that apply to the use of model aircraft can be found in the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations, Part 101, titled Unmanned Aircraft and Rockets, or CASR 101. Don't confuse CASA, CASA, and CASR. One is the police and the other is the law. They are different. The regulations are stored online in a single repository along with all the other federal legislation that governs us at www.legislation.gov.au. The 54 pages of CASR 101 are currently stored in Volume 3 of the Civil Aviation Act 1998, along with CASR 99 through to 137. CASR 101 Parts A, B, C and G are what concerns us as hobby users. Keep in mind that you will not find any CASR 101 legislation on the CASA website itself. What you will find on the CASA website is guidance in the form of circulars, pamphlets and audio-visual commercials. CASA guidance itself is not law and it is not enforceable. Much of CASA's guidance is based on the legislation, but some is not. Let me clarify some terminology. CASA don't distinguish the difference between types of powered remote control aircraft. So to CASA, an RC plane, helicopter and multirotor are all just unmanned aircraft. They do distinguish the difference based on the use of the RC aircraft. So, RC aircraft used for hobby purposes are referred to as model aircraft, and RC aircraft used for commercial purposes are referred to as UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, or RPAs, remotely piloted aircraft. And for the record, 3 nautical miles is the same as 5.5 kilometres. So let's take a look at some of their guidance that is probably responsible for starting the myth. Last week I called CASA and spoke to Zane Tully, a CASA operations officer in the sport aviation team responsible for model aircraft. Zane gave me permission to quote and publish his comments, but not to replay our recorded phone conversation. Flying with Control is a pamphlet that offers CASA guidance. It is intended for model aircraft shops to provide it to new customers. The wording on this pamphlet was carefully considered and very deliberate. The 3 words to look out for are must, should and illegal. The words must and illegal correctly imply that there is legislation backing their guidance. For example, must operate in daylight hours, must not fly higher than 400 feet in controlled airspace, or it's illegal to fly for money. However, the word should relates to guidance that is not specifically backed up by legislation and is not enforceable in its own right. You should not fly within 5.5 kilometres of an airfield. So guidance and legislation are not always mutually inclusive. Zane comments that it doesn't say can't. Here's where they have used those clever words. So it says that you should not fly within 5.5 kilometres of an airfield. When asked if the brochure was misleading, Zane was quite defensive. The brochure has done the right thing. Perhaps I shouldn't be flying here. Remember, it says shouldn't, not can't, so therefore maybe I need to find out more about what I can and can't do. So if you don't want to worry about what regulation is, then just stay 5.5 kilometres away. The specific regulation is 101.075, operation near aerodromes. He says, it starts out by saying a person may operate an unmanned aircraft at an altitude above 400 feet AGL within 3 nautical miles. So the fact that it's talking about operation above 400 feet means you can operate below 400 feet. He adds that, however, Part 3 talks about the approach or departure path of a runway of an aerodrome. If you stay outside 5.5 kilometres, the 3 nautical miles, then you don't need to worry about this legislation so much. Different airports have different templates that relate to their designated approach and departure paths, but for obvious reasons, those zones are typically in the same direction as the runway. So there is potential to operate model aircraft in the zones perpendicular to the runway. When asked how it relates to heli landing sites and helipads, Zane commented, "If it's all clear, then the prevailing wind would determine the direction they come from. You should be more careful flying near a helipad because it's not so crystal clear what the approach and departure path will be. If you hear a helicopter coming, and generally you do, you should land." He says there is a common sense approach when it comes to helipads. In relation to Advisory Circular 101-3 or AC 101, Zane started with a disclaimer. He said, "I'm familiar with it, but we don't address it because it makes some incorrect references. AC is an information publication, not a regulation. So the head of power, being the regulation, overrides the AC." Section 8.1 of AC 101 states, "Before flying above 400 feet within controlled airspace or within 3 nautical miles of an aerodrome, the operator of a model aircraft must obtain permission," etc. To which Zane pointed out, when you come back to Regulation 101.075, less than 400 feet does not require an approval from the controlling authority, either Air Traffic Control or CASA, so as long as it's not in the approach or departure path. Regarding 8.2.1, which has similar wording, Zane quite abruptly pointed out that it's all talking about above 400 feet. Zane made it clear that the legislation is really written around one key message, but it has been expanded because common sense isn't so common anymore. He said, "There's one underlying regulation that everyone needs to remember, 101.055. Thou shalt not operate a model aircraft in such a way to create a hazard for other aircraft, persons or property." I also sent an email to CASA requesting clarification regarding operation of model aircraft for hobby purposes within 5.5 kilometres of an airport. I asked for reference to applicable legislation that outlines this. The response came a few days ago from Steve Fickling, who shares the same title as Zane, a Sport Aviation Operations Officer with CASA. Steve's response was very detailed and included aspects of model aircraft use that I had not even asked about. In relation to my question, he quoted the exact same regulations that Zane referred to, 101.055, Part 1, and 101.075, Parts 2 and 3, along with pointing out the physical characteristics of some airfield layouts and the fact that helicopters typically land into the wind. He finished with a simple statement that aligns with Zane's response. With this in mind, all the CASA education material uses the words "should not operate within 5.5 kilometres of an airfield" as opposed to "must not." Finally, I had a phone call with the Model Aeronautical Association of Australia, whom CASA recognise as an authority on the interpretation of the relevant regulations. Kevin Dodd, the MAAA National Secretary, confirmed that there is no blanket regulation that prevents operation of a model aircraft within 5.5 kilometres of an airport or aerodrome for hobby use. So why is something so simple so misunderstood? Well, the cultivars of the myth are easy to identify. Firstly, the media. Even some of the self-proclaimed aviation experts reporting on this topic fail to perform basic due diligence, checking the facts. Instead, they perpetuate the myth by altering the CASA guidance to reflect something it is not. Their error doesn't change the fact that no such regulation exists. Zane from CASA only had a short statement in relation to this. The legislation is being interpreted by the media incorrectly. The misinformation starts with them changing the words and sensationalising it. So next time somebody quotes you a media article as justification for their misguided ideas, you will know better. The second group that perpetuate the myth are some individuals and organisations within the professional UAV industry, most commonly recognised as aerial photographers. The CASR 101 legislation stipulates that if you are going to fly an unmanned aerial vehicle, i.e. any RC aircraft, for financial gain or reward, then it is considered a commercial operation and additional legislation applies. Specifically, there is a whole section of CASR 101 devoted to it, Section F, that does not apply to hobby model aircraft operators. Professional operators have to be certified, and in many cases they do require permission to fly within 5.5 kilometres of an aerodrome, regardless of the operating altitude. The certification comes from private organisations, and some of these even publish false and misleading guidelines on their websites in relation to hobby flying. Finally, there are the mobile apps, some of which are aligned with the companies that issue the certificates for professional operators. They can be a handy tool in identifying the locations of some aerodromes, but not definitive enough to rely on, since they inevitably just show a 5.5 kilometre radius around the aerodromes in their database. One app I found even claims to provide the CASA rules, but only shows a picture of the guidance pamphlet that is commonly misinterpreted. In closing, there are regulations that prevent flying model aircraft near airports and aerodromes, but not a blanket regulation that prohibits flying within 5.5 kilometres. If anybody tries to tell you otherwise, then get familiar with the regulations or contact CASA Sport Aviation Department for clarification. They are a government department that are paid for by you and I, the taxpayers. Fly responsibly and enjoy yourself.